They say the dark is quiet, but I don't think it is. Sometimes it listens back. Where are you right now? And what time is it where you are? Leave it in the comments. Just try to stay still. Sometimes the quiet moves. The rain had continued for days, soaking the roots of the old forest and painting the trees in a glossy sheen of decay. In a secluded cabin, not far from Lake Crescent, an aging park ranger named Jonathan Hale had been stationed for over 4 years. A man once hardened by combat and now wearied by silence, he had grown accustomed to the rhythm of isolation. Nights passed with the rustle of wind through moss-laden branches and the hiss of pine needles under steady rainfall. It was during one such evening that the discovery was made: a leather-bound ledger found wedged behind a false panel in a disused storeroom at the ranger station. The ledger bore no title on its cracked spine, only the impression of a wax seal long faded to a blur. Its pages were yellowed, brittle at the corners, and filled with script penned in iron gall ink. The first entry was dated March 1803, and the author had signed only a single name at the bottom of each entry. What began as routine accounts of forest conditions, animal sightings, weather records, and water levels soon shifted into unsettling territory. Page by page, the calm tone had grown more frantic. Ink had been smeared where the writer's hand had trembled, and in the margins, sketches had been scratched with unnatural haste, trees twisted into unrecognizable shapes, silhouettes with too many limbs, and faces drawn with hollow sockets and weeping black lines. One passage had described a thunderless night in which the moon had turned a sickly yellow, and a staggering man of ash and teeth had been seen dragging itself through a marsh near the North Fork. No tracks had been left behind. No animals had emerged for days afterward. The writer had called it a shepherd of the sunken, and his entries had grown increasingly feverish after that. As Jonathan read deeper into the ledger, he noticed the recurring name, the preacher. This figure had not been introduced with explanation, only reverently mentioned. The preacher stood at the foot of the glade again. The earth did not dare move. In another entry, when the wind died, he spoke without breath. The creature bent, then fell into itself. Drawings had accompanied these entries of a tall man in a long coat, a heavy wooden cross in one hand, and a leather book in the other. His face had never been fully rendered. Often it had been left unfinished, as though the artist had either forgotten the details or refused to include them. As the weeks passed, the account had shifted entirely. Thorne had stopped referring to himself as a watcher of the woods. Instead, he had begun writing in the voice of a witness, someone merely allowed to observe what lay beneath the forest's calm exterior. He had started recording not what had been seen, but what had been felt. On the third night, after finding the ledger, Jonathan had dreamt of ash falling from the sky and of a forest that breathed like lungs beneath the soil. Each breath had come with a sound, a low bass hum like a horn buried beneath centuries of rock. Something had stirred in that dream, tall and jointed, its limbs moving independently of gravity. Its face had not been seen, only sensed, as if it had hovered just outside his field of vision. The ledger had lain open on a stone altar, and blood had soaked the page. He had awakened gasping for air, the sound of that horn still resonating in his skull. The final legible entry in the journal had been dated precisely 200 years earlier, March 1803. It had ended mid-sentence. 3 nights later, the screaming had begun. At first it had been assumed to be wind. The Pacific forests had a way of warping sound through twisted canopies, but this had not been the wind. It had started at midnight, long pulsing cries that rose in unnatural intervals, as though timed with something vast and breathing. Animals had fled from the western quadrant of the forest. Entire herds of deer had been seen bolting across Highway 101. An eagle had been found dead outside Jonathan's cabin, its eyes removed cleanly from its skull. Tracks, long hoof-like impressions, had appeared in the soft earth near the Firewatch trail. They had not matched any known species, and they had not been arranged in any pattern recognizable as locomotion. It had looked like the creature had moved sideways, or backwards. The forest had grown stiller with each passing night. No birds, no frogs. Even the mosquitoes had vanished. The ground had begun to sink. Jonathan had marked the points on a map, first near Horain Forest, then Queets, then Ruby Beach. Small depressions had been discovered, 4 to 6 feet wide, as though a massive creature had placed its hand into the forest floor and pressed. Each depression had been encircled by dead moss and a fine black ash that did not respond to fire or moisture. A geological team had been scheduled to arrive, but no vehicle had passed through the entrance gate in over 3 days. The radio tower had failed that same night. But then 2 nights ago, the preacher had arrived. He had not walked down the trail. He had not arrived by vehicle. He had simply been there, standing at the edge of the woods in the waning mist, tall and still, with the same black coat described in the ledger. No footsteps had been heard. No birds had scattered. He had stood with a stillness that disturbed the wind itself. Jonathan had opened the cabin door and watched, breath shallow, as the man had turned and walked toward the trees. No word had been spoken. No gesture had been made. And still, Jonathan had followed. It had not felt like compulsion. It had not felt like a choice. The preacher had walked silently between the trees, his path illuminated only by the rare flash of lightning reflecting off slick leaves. With every step, the forest had seemed to tighten, the trunks bending subtly inward, the roots shifting in the earth. They had walked for nearly an hour, perhaps longer. Time had dissolved in the silence, and then they had reached the glade. It had not been marked on any map, a perfect circle of dying trees, their trunks hollowed out and leaning outward, as if something had once erupted from beneath. In the center, the earth had split open, not like a crack, but a wound. From it, a light had spilled upward, not bright, but dark, not warm but cold. It had shimmered in every direction, and no direction at once. A pulse had risen from that hole, a soundless tremor. The preacher had stepped to the edge and raised the book. Jonathan had dropped to his knees, and from the pit, something had begun to rise. The light from the wound in the forest floor writhed like a living thing. It had not been cast from any flame or bulb, nor had it flickered with the rhythm of fire. Instead, it had shimmered with slow, deliberate pulses, as though breathing, as though thinking. Jonathan remained on his knees, unable to tear his eyes away from the pit. The preacher stood motionless beside it, book in hand, as the blackened air above the opening began to twist. A shape, thin and translucent, coalesced from the shadows. It hovered in the space between the glade and the sky, expanding slowly, like ink dropped into water. Its outline was almost human, but wrong. Arms too long, joints placed in unnatural locations. Its head hung at an impossible angle as if waiting for instruction. No face could be seen, only a shifting veil where its features should have been, like layers of skin submerged in oil. The preacher did not flinch. His hand extended over the pit, fingers splayed, and a low hum rose from the pages of the book. Not a spoken prayer, not a chant, but something older, something buried beneath language. The pages glowed faintly, symbols dancing across the parchment like liquid metal, and with each breathless second, the air grew heavier. Then, the creature reacted. It recoiled slightly, as if in pain or resistance. The edges of its form fraying into black mist. A sound issued from its center, not a roar or a shriek, but a dense vibration, a frequency so low it rattled Jonathan's ribs. The trees bent away from it. The earth around the pit cracked. The preacher moved forward. One foot crossed the edge of the pit, and the symbols on the pages surged with brilliance. His voice emerged, not loud, not aggressive, but unwavering. The creature thrashed, its body elongated, splitting and recoiling like strands of shadow being ripped apart. Jonathan could feel heat rising from the wound in the earth, yet the air itself had grown icy. And then came the light. It burst forth, not from above, But below, from within the pit, a column of blinding whiteness speared upward, swallowing the preacher in the shadow in an instant. Jonathan raised an arm to shield his eyes, but the pressure was unbearable. His ears popped, his vision blurred, every cell in his body screamed to run, yet he remained fixed in place. The light vanished as quickly as it had come. The glade fell into stillness again. The preacher stood alone beside the pit. The creature was gone. The air was still, but the pit had not closed. Instead, its shape had changed, subtly but undeniably. What had once been a crude fissure was now a perfect octagonal shaft, descending straight into blackness. No sound rose from it, no movement, but the pulsing had returned, softer now, deeper. The preacher lowered the book, his head turned slightly toward Jonathan, though no eyes could be seen. Slowly, he stepped away from the pit and began to walk toward the far edge of the glade. Not a word was spoken, no glance was exchanged. He disappeared into the tree. Jonathan stumbled to his feet. His knees ached, and the cold had seeped into his bones. He approached the pit cautiously, every instinct screaming to stay away, and yet something compelled him to look. He gazed into the void. It was not empty. Symbols pulsed faintly along the inner walls, etched into the very earth, glowing red like dying embers. They spiraled downward in endless sequence, vanishing into a depth that defied understanding. No bottom could be seen, only the pulp. That night, Jonathan returned to the cabin with the pages of the ledger pressed tight against his chest. Sleep did not come. The next morning, the first hiker went missing. His name had been Thomas Bell, a 44-year-old amateur botanist from Spokane. According to the logbook, he had signed in at the ranger station shortly before noon, requesting a backcountry permit for a solo trek through the Bogachil Valley. His route had been well defined. The weather had been stable. He had not returned. By nightfall, a search party had been formed. Jonathan led the team, accompanied by 2 younger rangers and a German shepherd named Mako. They found Thomas's camp by a stream, undisturbed. His tent had been zipped shut. His pack had remained inside. Water had still boiled in his kettle, long evaporated to a white ring. But Thomas was gone. No sign of struggle, no blood, no tracks. Only one thing remained, a torn page. It had been pinned to the outside of the tent with a sharpened stick, the paper fluttering faintly in the wind. The handwriting had not matched Thomas's signature in the logbook. The ink had looked old. The words, "He is watching. He has seen the pit. The earth remembers what we buried." The second hiker vanished 2 nights later. Jonathan had read deeper into the ledger, now obsessed. He no longer slept. Food went untouched. The kerosene lamp remained lit night and day, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch when no one moved. The writer Thorne had described the same pattern. Once the pit had been uncovered, the disappearances had begun. Animals first, then people, always those who had wandered too close. The shadow, Thorne wrote, did not kill, it consumed, it remembered. He had drawn the symbol that had appeared on the shaft's inner walls, an inverted tree with its roots above, branches reaching downward. Around it had spiraled an ancient phrase in glyphs no linguist had ever recorded, but Jonathan had seen it before. In his dream, now, he knew. The pit was not a prison, it was a passage. The third disappearance shattered any illusion of coincidence. This time it wasn't a lone hiker or an overly ambitious camper. It was a forest ranger. Carla Vasquez, 29, had gone to investigate a series of strange markings reported near Ho Rainforest. She was sharp, steady, and not prone to panic. When she failed to report back by evening, a full-scale operation launched at dawn. They found her radio still on, lying in the mud beside a cedar tree stripped bare to its core. Her boots were there too, both neatly placed side by side as if removed with care. No footprints led away, no signs of a struggle, just silence. And another note. This one was tucked beneath a moss-covered rock near her last known location. It was written in the same ink, the same aged paper as the first. This time the words read, "She stepped too close. The watchers below do not forget."
The preacher cannot stop what has already been spoken. Jonathan trembled as he read those words aloud to the other rangers. He didn't explain why they chilled him more than anything else so far. He didn't show them the matching phrase in the ledger, because he'd already started to dream in glyphs. The pit had begun to change. Each night Jonathan returned to the clearing, compelled by a force that felt both external and internal, like gravity of the mind. The shape of the shaft shifted subtly, growing wider, the edges smoother. The red symbols within had begun to rise, slowly, one spiral ring at a time, like ink rising up a well. He couldn't read them, but he felt them vibrating in his bones, thrumming just behind his eyes.
The nightmares had intensified. They no longer came as dreams of distant symbols or disjointed sounds. Now he stood at the bottom of the pit, naked beneath a sky of writhing roots. Creatures, with eyes of flame, watched from alcoves carved into the stone walls, and a voice, neither male nor female, whispered directly into his skull. You were chosen to find the page. You will write the rest. He woke each time with dirt beneath his fingernails and blood at the edges of his tongue. Still, he returned. He couldn't explain why. He didn't tell anyone. The forest was thinning. He told them. Too many search parties. Too many disturbances. That was why no one came near the clearing anymore. He had made sure of it. The fourth disappearance came quietly. No name, no witness, just a shoe. It had been placed at the ranger station entrance, carefully balanced atop the door frame. When Jonathan reached to open it, it fell neatly into his hands. Inside the shoe was another torn page. No ink this time, just a burned handprint. And beside it, a faint glyph etched with something sharp, curling like a snake eating its tail. Jonathan knew that symbol. He had drawn it in the dirt beside the pit the night before, but he hadn't remembered doing it. On the 30th day, the preacher returned. It was near dusk, just as the sun dipped behind the western peaks and cast the trees in molten silhouette. Jonathan was sitting by the pit, watching the light pulse from within like a lighthouse for the dead. Then a shadow crossed the clearing. He turned. There he stood, coat dark with rain, boots caked in moss, book in hand. No introduction, no explanation, only those eyes, steady, eternal, unreadable. The preacher approached the pit slowly. Jonathan didn't speak. He felt a tremor rise through the ground, like something shifting deep below. The glyphs had reached the rim now, and with each pulse a wave of warmth swept outward. Finally the preacher spoke. His voice was low, solid, carved from stone. You opened it too far. Jonathan tried to respond, but no words came. The preacher knelt at the pit's edge, laying the book across his knees. His fingers traced the outer ring of symbols. He frowned. The ledger has been altered. This language wasn't in the first layer. Jonathan blinked. First layer. The preacher looked at him then. Really looked. And Jonathan felt it like a blow to the chest. Not malice. Not judgment. Something else. Pity. You read too much, the preacher said. You listened when you should have walked away. He placed a hand against Jonathan's forehead, and everything changed. It was not a vision. It was a memory, but not Jonathan's. He stood within the shell of a ruined cathedral, shattered stained glass covering the floor like frozen blood. The stars above had aligned in ways they should never have, and in the center of the apse stood a pulsing pit, identical to the one in the forest. Around it knelt 12 figures, robed, faceless. Each held a page. Each whispered in a tongue older than fire. Then he saw the preacher, younger, but unchanged, stand between them, a blade of light in one hand, the ledger in the other. He had sealed the pit with blood, with sacrifice, and for 200 years, the ledger had been a lock until Jonathan read it. He gasped, falling back from the preacher's hand. Sweat drenched his shirt. His fingernails were cracked and bleeding. The clearing pulsed with energy. Raw, ancient. The preacher stood. "It can still be sealed," he said, "but not without cost." Jonathan looked up, unable to move, unable to ask the question burning in his throat. The preacher turned toward the pit, his back straight. He opened the ledger, and the forest held its breath. The air thickened as the preacher turned each page of the ledger. Wind stirred without direction, circling the glade in unseen eddies. The pit, now fully outlined in living symbols, began to emit a sound. Not a hum, not a roar, but the layered murmur of 1,000 voices speaking in unison just below the threshold of understanding. They did not chant. They remembered. Jonathan remained frozen on the ground, the memory of the ruined cathedral still pulsing behind his eyes. He now understood what the ledger truly was. Not a journal, but a seal, a contract, a binding forged with ink, will, and blood. Each story written into it had been more than record. It had been a link in a chain forged across time. And now, because of him, that chain had rusted. The preacher stepped forward, bare hand hovering over the pit. The voices rose in volume, overlapping in disharmony. Protests, pleas, threats. The ground beneath them cracked, revealing veins of lightless red. The trees around the glade bowed outward, as if retreating. From the depths of the pit, something answered. It didn't climb. It unfolded. A shape rose with geometric precision, its limbs too thin and too many, formed of dark root and smoke. Faces bloomed and withered across its surface, some human, some animal, some unrecognizable, each one screaming silently. Its height grew impossibly fast, dwarfing the preacher, blocking the moonlight with a mass that defied the laws of flesh. It reached for Jonathan first, but the preacher moved. He didn't run. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked into the thing's shadow, arms raised, ledger open in one hand, cross shining from the other. The entity recoiled as though struck by flame. The glyphs around the pit erupted in brightness, searing into the earth like molten scars. The preacher began to speak, not in English, nor Latin, but in the same tongue as the ledger. The language tore through the air like thunder underwater. With each word the shadow shrieked, not in sound, but in pressure. Jonathan clutched his skull, blood trickling from his ears. The preacher's voice grew louder. The symbols climbed higher. The pit shuddered, then started to close. The entity flailed, losing coherence. Its faces split and bled into one another. Clawed limbs scraped the air in desperate arcs. It began to sink, pulled downward by invisible hands. The preacher pressed forward, still reciting, stepping onto the very lip of the closing shaft. And then the light returned, not from the pit, from him. It burst from his chest, his eyes the pages of the ledger, golden pure like sunlight through clean water. The sound stopped. The creature froze. Every fiber of its impossible body turned toward that light. Then implosion, a soundless collapse. The pit vanished. So did the preacher. Silence fell, not the ominous silence of before, a clean one, the kind left in the wake of something sacred. Jonathan remained in the glade long after the light faded, sitting beside the scorched circle where the pit had been. In the preacher's place, only two things remained: the ledger, closed once more, and a single word etched into the earth beside it. Remember. The disappearances stopped. The forest returned to its natural rhythms. Search parties were recalled. Investigations closed quietly. Reports were buried. The pit had not only been sealed, it had been erased. Jonathan never returned to the glade, but the ledger stayed with him, tucked in a hidden compartment beneath the ranger station floorboards. He no longer read it. He no longer dreamed. But every so often in the stillest hours of the night, he would light a single candle and run his fingers along the cover, not to summon, not to fear, but to remember. Because somewhere out in the wilderness,
Across mountains and centuries, the preacher still walks, and darkness still stirs beneath the soil. But the word still holds, as long as someone keeps the ledger closed.
The sun sank low over the dense horizon of the Gran Chaco, washing the tangled forest in a deep orange hue as the last of the heat clung to the cracked red soil. Dust rose behind every bootstep, thick and clinging, settling into the air like pollen. Birds had stopped calling. Even the cicadas, normally an ever-present buzz, had gone silent. Sebastian Diaz, 36 years old and long hardened by life in the Paraguayan lowlands, pulled his wide-brimmed hat tighter over his brow. A machete swayed against his hip with every step as he moved toward the cassava plot near the edge of his property. Beside him, his daughter Noelia, barely 11, struggled to keep pace with the heavy basket slung over one arm. She didn't complain, but her eyes kept flicking toward the darkening brush just off the path. The community near Campo Loma Verde had grown restless. Chickens were vanishing in the night. Hoof prints, small and human-like, had been found circling pens, and at night, just before the wind died, came a whistle, thin, distant, but unmistakable. It had no pattern and no source, yet it moved closer some nights, farther others. Locals had begun murmuring again, as they always did when the shadows lingered too long. Stories drifted between households, whispered over tea, and under breath. Pombero. It wasn't a word that Sebastian liked. He was not one for superstition, not since he'd taken over the farm from his grandfather. But the Chaco had a way of pressing on a man's mind, especially when it got quiet like this, when the trees loomed a little too close, and the dark seemed to listen. "We won't be long," he said aloud, more to fill the air than to calm his daughter. "Just enough for supper." Noelia nodded, though her grip on the basket tightened. Her lips were pressed into a line. She had heard the whistle too. Everyone had. They entered the field, the rows of cassava scrubby and dry from the long season. The work was simple. Sebastian loosened the roots with a wood-handled trowel, and Noelia gathered them. The rhythmic pull in place helped settle his nerves. Almost. Then the wind stopped, so completely, so unnaturally, that Sebastian paused mid-dig. No branches stirred, no leaves fluttered, no insects clicked. Noelia froze. A whistle cut through the silence, low, slow, from just beyond the clearing, then another, closer. The basket dropped from Noelia's hands. She looked at her father, her mouth trembling but silent. Sebastian straightened and reached for the machete. He didn't speak. No comfort would work now, not with the forest watching. Underscore 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 underscores to the left rustled. Then the ones to the right. Sebastian held the machete low, blade angled forward. Noelia moved behind him, her breath shallow and fast. That's when he saw it. A pair of eyes, too low to belong to a man, too high for a crawling animal, gleamed yellow through the brush. They didn't blink, they didn't move, they just stared. Then a footstep, deliberate, light. A figure emerged. It was smaller than he expected, no taller than Noelia, but hunched, misshapen, covered in tangled hair matted with thorns and burrs. Its limbs were long and sinewy, fingers ending in curling nails. The mouth, barely visible beneath a sloping brow, opened to reveal sharp, uneven teeth. Another whistle hissed between them, not blown, exhaled. The creature stepped forward. Sebastian didn't wait. He swung the machete hard, The blade met nothing but air. The creature had vanished to the left. A blur of motion, something sharp, dragged across Sebastian's thigh. Quick, precise, a line of fire opened in his skin. He stumbled, cursed, turned, but the thing was circling now, weaving in and out of view. Whistling, always whistling. Noelia whimpered, then it stopped. The whistling, the movement, everything. The air shuddered. From the opposite end of the clearing, the trees parted, and something else stepped through. What emerged from the trees was not something Sebastian had a name for. At first, it looked like a shadow too large to belong to anything alive. Then the details came into focus. A shape broader than any man, at least 3 meters tall, with limbs like tree trunks, and a coat of thick, matted fur the color of old bark. Its face, if it could be called that, was human-like in structure, but in proportions far older, far more primal. The brow was heavy and prominent, the eyes sunken but aware. A nose, flat and wide, flared as it drew in deep, rumbling breaths. Lips peeled back, not in a snarl, but in a kind of restrained focus, revealing massive teeth, dulled but still dangerous. It didn't move with violence. It didn't move with fear. It moved with purpose. The Pombero froze. The creature's hunched figure seemed to recoil without taking a step, and its head tilted with a series of bird-like jerks. Then it let out a whistle, shrill this time, urgent. The tall figure responded, not with a sound but with movement. A step forward, one massive foot landing in the dust, with a dull thud that seemed to shake the dry soil. Its long arms swung low, almost brushing the ground, hands half curled and ready. Another step. The Pombero shrieked. It dashed forward, right past Sebastian and Noelia, toward the trees behind them. But the towering figure moved faster. In 2 strides, it cut off the path and reached out one great arm. Fingers like gnarled roots snapped shut around the Pombero's torso, lifting the creature from the ground as if it were made of paper. The smaller being clawed, shrieked, twisted, but it couldn't free itself. The taller one looked at it for a long moment, not with fury, not with hunger, but with judgment, and then it threw it. The Pombero flew through the clearing, tumbling mid-air until it hit the base of a cabraco tree with a sickening crack. It crumpled, twitched once, and vanished into the brush, disappearing into the undergrowth with a soft, slithering rustle. No whistle followed. Silence. Sebastian stood frozen, one hand gripping Noelia's arm, as if it were the only anchor keeping them from unraveling. His thigh still burned, blood seeping into his torn pants, but his eyes were locked on the giant. The creature didn't look at him immediately. It seemed to be listening, head tilted, body still, like it was sensing the air. Then it turned. Their eyes met, and Sebastian realized this thing was not just muscle and instinct. There was intelligence there, awareness, perhaps even empathy. It took one more breath, its shoulders rising and falling like the swell of a wave, and stepped back into the trees. The forest swallowed it in seconds. No twigs snapped, no leaves crunched. It was gone. Sebastian exhaled a breath he didn't remember holding. He sank to his knees. Noelia collapsed against his side, weeping quietly. There were no words, not yet. He didn't try to explain to her what had happened, because he couldn't. 2 legends, one feared, one never spoken of in these parts, had crossed paths right in front of them, and something far older than men had decided, in that moment, to protect them. They left the cassava behind. The basket was forgotten in the grass. Sebastian limped all the way back to the village, Noelia silent at his side. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. The answer was in the bruises on her father's leg, and the tremble in his hands. The house lights never looked so warm. Inside, Sebastian's wife, Lucia, looked up from the fire, and went pale when she saw them. Noelia was pulled into her arms before a word was spoken. The story was told in whispers, not to neighbors, not yet, only to Lucia, only as much as needed.
Then came the part Sebastian dreaded most. The following morning arrived swathed in uneasy light. A dense fog clung to the Chaco forest like a second skin, muffling sound and bending the shape of everything it touched. The trees, once proud and rigid, appeared warped. Even the sun seemed hesitant to rise fully. Sebastian awoke early, long before the birds resumed their songs. His leg ached, where the pombero's claws had ripped his flesh, but it was the memory of those glowing yellow eyes that kept him from resting. He sat at the edge of the bed, his breath shallow, as if the house itself might collapse if he made a sound. Lucia entered quietly. She carried a folded cloth and a bowl of warm water steeped in herbs, yacareyuyo, and guavira leaves, meant to draw out infection and ease pain. Her fingers moved with the steady rhythm of care passed down for generations. She didn't speak, neither did he, not at first. When the cloth touched his wound, he flinched, not from the sting, but from the memory. Lucia finally broke the silence. "You saw it, didn't you?" He nodded. The pombero, another nod, and something else. He looked up. It wasn't human. She hesitated. "But it helped you." He said nothing more.
Word traveled quietly in Philadelphia. Too many chickens had vanished. Too many goats had been found dead, their throats slit open, eyes pecked out, bodies left untouched, except for their tongues and hooves. The older villagers no longer whispered Pombro behind closed doors. They said it aloud now, in church, over wells, in the morning gatherings outside the bakery. Some began to leave offerings again. Honey in small bowls, unlit cigars left in hollow tree trunks, but others feared it was too late, that something had changed in the forest, that the Pombro had grown bold. 2 days after Sebastian's encounter, the schoolhouse near the river was found empty. All 8 desks stood untouched, the chalkboard still bearing a math problem in neat white script. The teacher, a 28-year-old woman named Elisa Root, was gone. Only her shoes remained, perfectly placed at the threshold of the schoolhouse door. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, just silence, and the trees watching. That evening, a group of men gathered in the community hall. The elders sat at one end, hunched and quiet, while the younger men, farmers, cattle hands, tradesmen, argued over what to do. Sebastian stood near the door. He hadn't meant to speak, but when the discussion turned to forming search parties, he found his voice rising before he realized he was talking. "There's something else out there," he said. "Something bigger than the Pombro." Murmurs filled the room. He described the creature, not as a monster, but as something ancient, something protective. An older man spat on the floor. "You saw a demon." "No," Sebastian replied. "I saw a guardian." It didn't convince them, but it sowed a seed of silence. Later, as the men dispersed and the kerosene lanterns were blown out, one of the elders approached Sebastian in the dark. A hand was placed on his shoulder. "There are stories," the old man whispered, "older than this colony, before the Mennonites came. Stories of the one who watches the forest. We called him the Man of Silence. He only comes when the balance is broken." Sebastian felt the weight of the words settle into his spine. That night, Lucia dreamed of fire. In her dream, the cassava field burned. The forest howled. Trees cracked and screamed as though alive. She awoke to the scent of smoke in her nose. She rushed outside. In the distance, just past the hills, a black column of smoke rose toward the sky. The fire had devoured the cassava field. Sebastian stood at the edge of the clearing, the soil beneath his boots still warm. Ash clung to the air like regret. The once vibrant stalks lay in charred ruin, blackened roots twisted and steaming. The trail of destruction led beyond the field's edge, where scorched underbrush painted a path into the deeper forest. He wasn't alone. Around him, Villagers gathered in silence. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The message was clear. The Pombro had returned in full wrath, and this time, the fire was its voice. The elders came forward with trembling hands and rapt faces. One of them, a woman with skin like sun-dried leather and cataract-hazed eyes, stepped toward Sebastian. From beneath her shawl, she drew a pouch of honeycomb and pressed it into his palm. "This forest has memory," she rasped. "It knows blood. It knows kindness. Offer both." Sebastian and Lucia waited until dusk. At the edge of the forest, where the cassava field once stood, they laid the offering: honeycomb, raw tobacco, a candle carved from beeswax, and a silver medallion of Saint Francis, Lucia's, placed without hesitation. They said no prayers. They simply waited. The sun sank below the horizon, and the light turned violet, then black. The forest swallowed the last golden threads, and silence bloomed. Then came the whistle. Soft, coaxing, familiar. Sebastian gripped his machete, but did not lift it. He stepped forward, alone, into the mouth of the trees. The forest parted like breath. The trail ahead shimmered faintly, lined with crushed leaves that smelled not of rot, but of something older: musk, sap, blood. The whistle came again, closer. He turned a corner, and there it stood, the Pombro, short, shrouded in shadow, eyes glowing like twin coals. It tilted its head, as if in recognition. A hand, too many jointed clawed, extended toward him. Sebastian did not flinch. Instead, he reached into the pouch and dropped the honeycomb at the creature's feet. The Pombro crouched, sniffed, its head twitched. Then it let out a low click from deep within its throat and turned toward the forest's heart and walked. Sebastian followed. They reached the grove at the base of the hill. There, under the moonlight, the earth had opened. A shallow pit, rimmed by bones, not animal bones, human, cracked and blackened by fire. Dozens. The Pombro circled it, dragging its fingers through the ashes. Sebastian stood motionless, until he realized the bones were not recent. They were ancient. Burial offerings, perhaps. Sacrifices. A graveyard. A warning. Then a new sound rose, low, rhythmic, like stones grinding together. From the shadows behind the grove, something stirred. The guardian. Towering and silent, the same creature that had saved him and Clara. Its eyes glowed, not with heat, but with age. It looked at the Pombro first, then at Sebastian. Then it stepped into the moonlight. In its hand, it held something. A shoe, Elisa's. It placed it at the edge of the pit, then pointed, not at the bones, at the trees beyond. Sebastian moved forward. With each step, he felt time stretch. The air thickened. Reality wavered. He passed through the grove and emerged on the other side, into an open space he'd never seen on any map. A clearing surrounded by white-barked trees, their branches devoid of leaves. In the center, standing alone, was Elisa, alive, eyes wide, frozen. When Sebastian approached, she blinked, then collapsed into his arms. They returned as the first rays of sun lit the forest in gold. Behind them, the guardian vanished into the trees. The Pombro watched from a distance, unmoving, before disappearing into the undergrowth with a final whistle, neither angry nor pleased, just present, balanced. Back in Philadelphia, no one asked for details. No one had to. Elisa was safe. That was enough. The offerings continued, placed weekly now by villagers who no longer mocked the stories. Sebastian never returned to the cassava field. He built a new garden closer to home, planted it with tobacco and honey flowers. Lucia left the medallion at the edge of the forest, beneath a tree that seemed to grow taller with every passing week. Clara grew quiet, but strong. Sometimes at night, she sat on the porch and listened, not for the wind, not for birdsong, but for the faint, careful whistle in the dark. And Sebastian, he dreamed, not of monsters, but of watchers, of ancient packs and of balance restored.